They had no idea who they were mocking. On the sun-scorched asphalt of the Marine Corps rifle range, a place where noise was a form of currency and dominance was measured in decibels, she was an anomaly, a pocket of profound silence. A group of Marines, young and hard and molded by the relentless shouting of their gunnery sergeant, saw only a small woman in a tattered field jacket, a stray bird that had wandered into a den of wolves. They saw her torn sleeve in the faded fabric and laughed, their amusement a cheap and easy bond. They saw her quiet focus as she cleaned a rifle optic and mistook it for weakness. They had no idea they were standing on the edge of a cliff, laughing at the abyss, unaware that the quiet woman before them was not the abyss itself, but the one who had mastered it. The air at Quantico that afternoon was thick enough to chew, a suffocating blanket of Virginian humidity woven with the sharp metallic tang of gunpowder and the ozone scent of distant, brewing thunderstorms. It was an atmosphere that bred aggression, that seemed to demand a loud and forceful response to its oppressive weight. In this cauldron of sweat and simmering violence, Gunnery Sergeant Rex Thorne was king. He was a man carved from granite and fury, with a barrel chest that strained the fabric of his perfectly starched camis and a voice that was not so much a sound as it was a geological event. When Thorne spoke, it was a rockslide, an avalanche of gravel and command that stripped a man's confidence down to the bone and left him shivering in the raw exposure of his own inadequacy. He moved through his kingdom of recruits, a sea of shaved heads and tense, corded necks, like a shark patrolling its reef, his presence a constant low-grade threat that kept everyone on edge. Thorne believed, with the unshakable conviction of a zealot, in the gospel of visible strength. To him, power was a performance. It was the boom of his voice echoing off the corrugated steel of the firing line sheds. It was the percussive slap of his hand on a recruit's helmet. It was the way a room fell silent when he entered it, the way lesser men, and to Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, all other men were lesser, shrank from his gaze. His entire world was a carefully constructed edifice of dominance, a hierarchy where he sat near the top, roaring down at those below. He demanded respect not as a byproduct of leadership, but as a tribute, an offering to the angry god of his own ego. His sycophants, like the lean and sneering Corporal Miller who shadowed his every step, were the high priests of this cult, amplifying his pronouncements and basking in the reflected glare of his authority. They mistook his volume for valor, his arrogance for authority. In his mind, the universe was simple. There were predators and there were prey. There were hammers and there were nails. He was a hammer. His job was to pound the soft metal of these recruits into the hardened nails the Corps demanded. Anything that did not fit this binary, anything that was quiet or subtle or introspective, was not just different. It was wrong. It was a flaw in the system, a weakness to be identified, isolated, and brutally hammered out of existence. He saw silence not as a sign of contemplation or control, but as an admission of fear, a vacuum that his own noise was duty-bound to fill. His worldview was a fortress built of loud certainties, and he stood upon its ramparts, bellowing at a world he had simplified into submission. And then he saw her. She was sitting on an overturned ammunition crate at the far end of the range, away from the rhythmic crack and pop of the firing line. She was an island of stillness in his ocean of controlled chaos. The heat shimmered off the asphalt around her, but she seemed to occupy a space where the air was cooler, calmer. She was small-framed, almost lost inside a faded olive-drab field jacket that was far too large for her. The fabric was worn thin in places, and a significant ragged tear ran down the length of the left sleeve, revealing a pale arm beneath. She had a rifle propped on a bench beside her, a high-end precision model that looked jarringly out of place, and she was bent over its detached optic, her hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace, cleaning the lenses with a small cloth. Her presence was a dissonant note in the symphony of aggression Thorne conducted. She did not belong. She wore no uniform, no rank, no insignia of any kind that would place her within his rigid hierarchy. She was simply there, a civilian, a woman, a quiet, unassuming figure in a place that celebrated the exact opposite. She was an affront to the established order, a question mark scribbled onto his perfectly organized slate. The dust motes that danced in the shafts of sunlight seemed to settle around her, repelled by the restless energy that churned everywhere else. Her focus was absolute, a laser beam of concentration aimed at the delicate task in her hands, rendering the surrounding noise and fury utterly irrelevant. Thorne watched her for a long moment, his jaw tightening. His internal calculus began its brutal work. Small, female, civilian clothes, torn jacket, silent. The variables added up to a single glaring sum: weak, prey, a nail waiting for a hammer. But it was more than that. Her complete lack of acknowledgement, her serene indifference to his domain, was not just weakness. It was a form of disrespect. It was a silent challenge to his authority, more infuriating than any shouted insult. He felt a familiar, hot surge of indignation. The brittle shell of his ego, so carefully lacquered with the respect and fear of his subordinates, had been pricked by her quiet apathy. He decided, in that instant, that she would be his next lesson. He would make an example of her. He would use her as a whetstone to sharpen the fear of his recruits. He turned to Corporal Miller, a smirk twisting his lips. "Well, well, Miller, look what we have here. Seems a little bird has gotten lost from its nest." Miller, ever the echo, snickered on cue. "Looks more like a street rat, Gunny. Look at that jacket. Probably found it in a dumpster." The laughter, though quiet, was sharp enough to draw the attention of the nearby recruits. They turned, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. A new performance was about to begin. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne began his slow, deliberate approach, his boots crunching on the gravel with theatrical weight. He moved with the swagger of a man who owned the very ground beneath his feet, his shadow falling over her long before he arrived. He was creating a spectacle, drawing the focus of the entire range onto this one small, silent woman. This was his stage, and he was the master of ceremonies. He stopped directly in front of her, planting his feet wide, a mountain of a man casting a deep shadow. She did not look up. Her hands, steady and precise, continued their methodical polishing of the glass. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Thorne let it hang in the air, a tool he used to heighten the drama. He wanted her to feel the weight of his presence, the pressure of dozens of pairs of eyes fixed upon her. He wanted her to squirm. She did not. "Lost, sweetheart." His voice was a low growl, laced with a condescending sweetness that was more menacing than any shout. It was the voice of a predator playing with its food. Still, she did not look up. Her focus remained on the lens in her hand. After a moment, a quiet, flat voice emerged, seemingly from the task itself rather than from her. "I'm not lost." The lack of deference, the absence of the required gunnery sergeant or even a simple "sir," was like a splash of gasoline on the embers of his irritation. He gestured with a thumb toward his audience of recruits. "You hear that, maggots? She's not lost. She's just decided to grace our humble firing range with her presence. Should we feel honored?" A ripple of forced, nervous laughter went through the young Marines. They knew their part to play. Their fear of the gunnery sergeant far outweighed any sense of impropriety. They were the chorus, and their role was to validate his power. If you believe true respect is earned through action, not demanded by rank-type respect in the comments. Thorne leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial rumble, yet ensuring it was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tell me something, ma'am. That jacket. Is that some kind of fashion statement? The 'I'm too poor to afford buttons' look? Or did a dog get a hold of you?" He pointed a thick finger at the long, ragged tear on her sleeve. "This is a United States Marine Corps facility. We have standards here. Pride, bearing. You look at this jacket," he boomed, turning to the recruits. "This is the absence of pride. This is what weakness looks like. Remember that." The woman finally paused her work. She set the lens down on the cloth with painstaking care. Slowly, she lifted her head, and for the first time, Thorne saw her eyes. They were a pale, washed-out gray, the color of a winter sky over a cold sea. And they were utterly, unnervingly calm. There was no fear in them, no anger, no emotion at all. It was like looking into the eyes of a statue. They simply registered his presence, analyzed it, and dismissed it as irrelevant data. "The jacket is functional," she said, her voice still a quiet monotone, devoid of inflection. "The optic is not. The parallax adjustment is off." Her technical, dispassionate response was so far from the reaction he had expected, fear, tears, a stammered apology, that it momentarily threw him off balance. He had built a stage for a drama of intimidation, and she had refused to read her lines. His frustration curdled into genuine anger. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was a subversion of his entire reality. He needed to reassert control, to force her back into the role he had assigned her. He took a step closer, his physical presence now overwhelming. He reached out and placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, his fingers digging into the worn fabric of the jacket. It was a flagrant violation of personal space, a final physical assertion of dominance. "I don't care about your little toy, sweetheart. I care about the fact that you're on my range, in my house, looking like a piece of trash and showing zero respect." She glanced down at his hand on her shoulder, her expression unchanging. Then she looked back up at his face. "Your hand is in my way." Crack. It was the sound of Thorne's control finally snapping. The quiet defiance, the utter refusal to be intimidated, had pushed him over the edge. His face flushed a deep mottled red. His voice, when it came out, was no longer a controlled growl, but a raw, furious bellow that made the recruits flinch. "You think you're tough? You think you can come here to a place where real warriors are made and act like you own it? You think you can handle a real weapon?" He spun around and pointed a trembling finger toward the far end of the range. 1,000 meters away, a series of standard silhouette targets stood shimmering in the heat. But beyond them, much further, was the advanced training section. There, a steel plate, no bigger than a dinner plate, was mounted on a swinging arm, a challenge target for the most elite snipers. As a final insult, a small, empty soda can had been placed on top of it by a cocky instructor earlier that day. It was a speck, a nearly invisible glint of red and silver against the dusty brown of the berm. "You see that can?" Thorne roared, his voice cracking with rage. "You see that little can way out there? 1,000 yards. Moving target. You think you're so smart, you and your little scope? Hit it. Go on. Hit that can, and I'll apologize. You miss, and you get the hell off my range and never come back." He had thrown down an impossible gauntlet. Hitting the plate itself at that range was a feat for a highly trained Marine sniper with a spotter and perfect conditions. Hitting a tiny, unsecured can on top of it was a statistical absurdity. It was a challenge designed not to be met, but to humiliate. It was the punchline to his cruel joke. Corporal Miller was openly grinning now, the recruits shifting on their feet, a mix of pity and morbid anticipation on their faces. They were about to witness a complete and total demolition. The woman looked from Thorne's contorted face to the distant, shimmering speck downrange. For the first time, a flicker of something moved in her eyes. It wasn't fear. It was a distant, cold light, the kind of light one sees in the moments before a lightning strike. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then she moved. The transition from stillness to action was so fluid it was almost invisible. One moment she was sitting, the next she was standing, the rifle in her hands as if it were a natural extension of her own body. Thorne and Miller exchanged a look of smug satisfaction. They misinterpreted her calm, economical movements as the hesitation of an amateur, the fumbling of someone who was in over their head. They saw her gently click the freshly cleaned optic back into its housing and thought it was the action of someone stalling for time. They watched her shoulder the weapon, her body settling into a stance that seemed too relaxed, too fluid to be effective, and they prepared their final mocking remarks. They did not see what a true professional would have seen. They did not see the ritual. They did not see the perfect practiced economy of every motion, the elimination of every wasted gesture. They did not see the way her body became a single, solid platform, an organic tripod of bone and muscle designed for one purpose: absolute stability. They did not see the slow, controlled exhalation of her breath, a technique that could slow a person's heart rate by half, turning the space between heartbeats into a vast, silent plain where a perfect shot could be made. They saw a woman with a rifle. They did not see a weapon system achieving its optimal firing solution. She didn't use the bench. She didn't use a bipod. She stood unsupported. The rifle rose, settled, and became as still as the earth beneath her feet. Her eye was at the scope. Her finger rested beside the trigger guard. The world, for her, had compressed into a narrow tube of magnified light. The shouting, the heat, the expectant faces of the recruits, all of it dissolved into an irrelevant, blurry periphery. There was only the reticle, her breath, and the tiny shimmering speck of red 1,000 yards away. The wind, which had been a nuisance all day, she felt not as a force, but as data, a subtle pressure on her cheek that her mind instantly translated into clicks of elevation and windage. Thorne opened his mouth to shout another taunt, to add the final nail to her coffin of humiliation. Ping. The sound was not loud. It was a small, precise, almost delicate noise that traveled back across the 1,000 yards of superheated air. It was the sound of a small piece of copper-jacketed lead traveling at over 2,000 feet per second, striking a small piece of aluminum. It was the sound of impossibility. Downrange, the tiny red can did not just fall off the steel plate, it vanished. One moment it was there, a glint of color in the haze. The next, it was a pinkish-red mist that hung in the air for a fraction of a second before being whisked away by the breeze. The steel plate behind it swung gently, untouched. A silence, profound and absolute, descended upon the range. It was a different kind of silence than the woman's. Hers had been a silence of calm. This was a silence of shock. It was a heavy, ringing vacuum where the laws of physics and probability had just been torn to shreds and rewritten by a single, quiet action. The recruits stood frozen, their mouths slightly agape, their eyes wide with disbelief. Corporal Miller's smug grin had dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed stare of utter incomprehension. And Gunnery Sergeant Rex Thorne. His face was a mask of shattered reality. The world he had built with its simple rules of loud and quiet, strong and weak, had just been leveled by a quiet, inexplicable event. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A fluke, a lucky shot, an accident. But his gut, the primal instinct of a man who had spent his life around weapons, knew the truth. What he had just witnessed was not luck. It was a level of skill so far beyond his own comprehension that it might as well have been magic. It was perfection. The woman lowered the rifle. Her movements were just as calm and deliberate as before. There was no sign of triumph on her face, no smirk of victory, no "I told you so" in her eyes. She showed no more emotion than a master carpenter would after driving a nail perfectly straight. The impossible feat was, to her, merely a task completed. She ejected the single spent casing, which spun through the air with a tiny glint of brass before landing softly in the dust. She placed the rifle back on the bench, picked up her cleaning cloth, and sat down on the ammo crate. She went back to cleaning her scope. It was at that moment of stunned, suspended animation that a new sound intruded. The crunch of tires on the gravel access road. A black command vehicle, the kind reserved for high-ranking officers, pulled up and parked with quiet efficiency. The dust had not even settled when the passenger door opened. A man stepped out, tall and lean, wearing the crisp, perfectly pressed uniform of a Marine Corps colonel. On his collar were the silver eagles of his rank, and on his chest was a salad of ribbons that told a story of decades spent in the most dangerous places on Earth. This was Colonel Marcus Vance, the base commander. His presence radiated an authority that was nothing like Thorne's. It was not loud or performative. It was a cold, quiet, unshakable gravity that bent the world around it. The moment he stepped out of the vehicle, every recruit on the range snapped to attention, their bodies rigid with a fear and respect that Thorne's bellowing could never truly command. Colonel Vance's eyes swept the scene, taking in the frozen tableau. The stunned recruits, the bewildered-looking gunnery sergeant, and the quiet woman on the ammo crate. His gaze, sharp and analytical, lingered on her for a moment, and a flicker of recognition. Then profound respect entered his expression. He ignored everyone else and walked directly toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed but radiating command. "Kyle," he said. His voice was calm, but it cut through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "I didn't know you were stateside. I thought you were still working with the teams in the Hindu Kush." The woman, Kyle, looked up from her scope. She offered the colonel a small, tight smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Finish the contract. Just running some diagnostics on the new optics before they ship out. The system was throwing an error. It was only then that Colonel Vance seemed to notice the petrified form of Gunnery Sergeant Thorne. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, which had been warm with recognition for the woman, turned to chips of ice. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sudden drop in temperature was more terrifying than any shout. "Gunnery Sergeant," he said, the words perfectly spaced, each one a hammer blow. "Report." Thorne, his face pale and slick with sweat, stammered, "Sir, Colonel, sir, this civilian was on the range, unauthorized. Vance cut him off with a slight raise of his hand. "You were making a fool of yourself, Gunnery Sergeant. You were mistaking quiet professionalism for weakness. You were judging a book not by its cover, but by a single torn page, and in doing so, you have displayed an ignorance so profound it borders on dereliction of duty. You stand here, on a range dedicated to teaching Marines how to be warriors, and you failed to recognize one of the finest warriors this nation has ever produced." The colonel's words hung in the dead air. He turned his gaze from the now trembling Thorne to the assembled recruits, who stood like statues, barely breathing. "Eyes front," he commanded, his voice now carrying a pedagogical weight. "You are about to receive the most important lesson of your careers. A lesson on the nature of true strength." He gestured toward the woman. "This is not a civilian. This is Chief Warrant Officer 5 Alara Kale, United States Navy, retired." He paused, letting the impossibly high rank sink in. A CW-5 was a living legend, a technical and tactical master with decades of experience. But Vance was not finished. Though most of the people she worked with for the last 20 years never called her by her rank, they called her by her operational call sign. Another pause. The tension was unbearable. They called her Wraith. A collective silent shockwave passed through the recruits. The name was mythology. A ghost story whispered in hushed tones in barracks and forward operating bases. Wraith, the operator who could go anywhere, do anything. The sniper, credited with impossible shots in Fallujah. The intelligence operative who had dismantled terror cells in the dead of night. A name spoken with the kind of reverence reserved for legends. It was a name that did not belong to a small, quiet woman on an ammo crate, and yet it did. Vance continued, his voice a low, reverent litany of her accomplishments. This woman was one of the first to pass the BUD/S selection process when it was opened. She served with SEAL Team 6 for over a decade. The list of her commendations is classified at a level most of you don't know exists. "The jacket you were mocking," he said, his eyes boring into Thorne. "She was wearing that jacket on a mission in the Korengal Valley when her position was overrun. She held off 24 enemy fighters alone for 6 hours until support could arrive, taking shrapnel from an RPG in the process. That tear," he said, pointing, "is from a piece of metal that nearly took her arm off. She patched herself up and kept fighting." He took a step toward her. "When she finally retired from active duty, she didn't stop. She now works for a special projects division, testing and developing the very weapons and optics that save the lives of Marines like you. She is here today, not because she is lost, Gunnery Sergeant, but because she is ensuring the rifle you put in a young Marine's hands will not fail him when he needs it most." He stopped and looked at the ragged tear on her sleeve one last time. Beneath it, just visible on the pale skin of her bicep, was a small, dark tattoo. Vance's eyes locked onto it. "Take off the jacket, Chief," he said softly. It was a request, not an order. Slowly, deliberately, Kyle stood. She shrugged off the torn, faded jacket. Underneath, she wore a simple gray t-shirt, and there, on her left bicep, stark and undeniable, was the tattoo. It was not large, but its symbolism was immense. A golden eagle clutching an anchor, a trident, and a flintlock pistol. The special warfare insignia. The SEAL Trident. A gasp went through the recruits. They were looking at a ghost, a legend made flesh. The air crackled with the discharge of 100 shattered assumptions. They had been watching a god, and they had not known it. Colonel Marcus Vance, a man who commanded thousands, a warrior in his own right, turned to face Chief Warrant Officer 5 Alara Kale. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. In the utter ringing silence of the Quantico afternoon, he brought his right hand up in a salute so crisp, so perfect, so laden with 2 centuries of military tradition and respect that it seemed to cut the air. It was not the perfunctory salute of a subordinate to a superior. It was the salute of a warrior to a legend, the ultimate gesture of respect. Thorne stood broken. His kingdom of noise had been conquered by a whisper. His fortress of arrogance had been leveled by a single, quiet fact. He was a man who had built his identity on a foundation of sand, and the tide of truth had just washed it all away. He mumbled a choked, inadequate apology that was lost in the vast, humbling silence. Colonel Vance dismissed him with a flick of his wrist, a gesture that ended not just the conversation, but Thorne's career. His authority, once a roaring fire, was now a pile of cold ash. The chorus of recruits had been transformed. They were no longer an audience for a bully's cruel theater. They were witnesses. Their understanding of strength, of power, of what a warrior looked like, had been irrevocably and profoundly altered. They looked at Kale not with the fearful respect they had shown Thorne, but with a new emotion, a deep, soul-shaking awe. They had seen the difference between a costume and the real thing. They had learned that the most dangerous predators are often the quietest ones. Kale, the ghost, simply acknowledged the colonel's salute with a short, sharp nod. Her focus had already returned to the matter at hand. She picked up the optic and turned to one of the range safety officers who stood nearby, looking as stunned as everyone else. Her voice was flat, technical, as if the preceding drama had never occurred. The windage is off by 0.2 mils on this optic. Have your armorers recalibrate the entire batch before they're issued. She then gathered her gear, packed it neatly into a simple black case, gave one last nod to the colonel, and walked away, her footsteps making barely a sound on the gravel. She disappeared as quietly as she had appeared, leaving behind a legend and a life-altering lesson. The story of that afternoon on the range spread like wildfire through the base, and then beyond. It became a piece of institutional folklore, a cautionary tale told to new recruits and cocky young non-commissioned officers. It was called The Day the Gunny Met the Ghost, a stark reminder that true competence doesn't need to advertise. It was a lesson whispered in every corner where arrogance began to fester. Be careful who you judge. You never know who is standing right in front of you. The loudest voice in the room is often the emptiest. Years later, a man named Rex Thorne could be found at a different training facility. He was older, grayer, and noticeably quieter. He was still a teacher of Marines, but his methods had changed. The roar was gone, replaced by a calm, measured tone. His primary lesson was no longer about aggression and dominance, but about humility and perception. He would often tell the story of a torn jacket and an impossible shot, not as a story of his own failure, but as a lesson in the profound danger of underestimation. He had been publicly dismantled, but from the wreckage of his pride, he had managed to build a foundation of true wisdom. He was a better man for it, and a far better teacher. And Alara Kyle, the Wraith? She was gone. She moved on to the next mission, the next piece of classified technology, the next quiet, vital task that kept the world safe while it slept. She was indifferent to the legend she had created. Her reward was not in the awe of others, but in the silent satisfaction of a job done to perfection. She remained what she had always been, an instrument of deadly precision, hidden in plain sight, her existence a testament to the fact that the most powerful forces in the universe are often the most silent. She was the calm at the eye of the storm, the quiet professional whose competence was its own unassailable authority. There is a fundamental truth about the nature of strength that we, as a species, are prone to forget. We are drawn to noise, to spectacle, to the grand performance of power. We equate volume with validity and swagger with substance. We build our hierarchies based on who can shout the loudest, who can posture the most convincingly. We construct brittle edifices of ego, decorated with titles and accolades, and we demand that the world pay tribute to them. But this is a profound misunderstanding of where true power resides. True power, true competence has no need for advertisement. It is quiet, it is focused, it is self-contained. It doesn't need to roar because it is the lion, not the one who shouts about the lion. It is a force of nature, like gravity or the turning of the tides, silent, relentless, and undeniable. The world is full of gunnery sergeant thorns. They are the overconfident middle managers who dismiss the quiet analyst in the corner, unaware that she holds the keys to the entire company's data. They are the celebrity chefs who mock the old woman in the village market, not knowing her family has perfected a recipe over generations that no culinary school could ever teach. They are the politicians who thunder from podiums, dismissing the quiet wisdom of the community elder who has seen a dozen such leaders come and go. People often judge what they do not understand, and their judgment is almost always a reflection of their own limitations, not the limitations of the person they are judging. The arrogance of a thorn is born from insecurity. It is a desperate, loud, and constant effort to convince both the world and, more importantly, oneself of a strength that feels precarious. The carefully constructed persona, the demand for deference, the lashing out at anything that does not conform to a rigid worldview. These are all the frantic actions of a man terrified that the flimsy walls of his own self-importance might collapse. The quiet competence of a Kyle, however, is born from mastery. It needs no external validation. It is not threatened by the noise of others because it operates on a plane of existence where such noise is irrelevant. It is the quiet confidence of the master artisan, the seasoned pilot, the veteran surgeon. Their skill is a fact, as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet, and it requires no announcement. It simply is. The lesson of the torn jacket and the impossible shot is not merely a military story. It is a human story. It is a call to look past the surface, to listen beneath the noise, to cultivate a humility that allows us to recognize greatness even when it appears in the most unassuming of packages. It is a reminder that the world is filled with hidden masters, with quiet professionals whose skill and dedication form the very bedrock of our civilization. They are not the ones on the stage. They are the ones who built the stage, who wired the lights, and who ensure the foundation is strong enough to hold the weight of all the empty posturing that happens upon it. True respect is not something that can be demanded at the top of one's lungs. It is a silent offering, given freely in the presence of undeniable, quiet excellence.